Hey everyone, Coach Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of the Language of Leadership. I'm joined today by Dr. Michelle K. Johnston, a management professor, executive coach, and leadership expert. Dr. Johnson is an award winning professor studying leadership and business communication and is the Gaston Chair of Business at Loyola University of New Orleans, where she teaches both graduate and undergraduate programs. Not only this, but she received her PhD in communication from Louisiana State University and has been named to the prestigious 100 Coaches Group, which is the creme de la creme, the top of the top of executive coaches around the world. And she's recently published The Seismic Shift in Leadership, an awesome book that we're going to jam on in just a little bit. Dr. Johnston, how are you doing today? Welcome, welcome.
I'm doing great, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm really looking forward to connecting with your listeners.
Thank you. We just gave just a very brief introduction to our guests as to who you are, but would it be possible to just share with us a little bit more about your experience and how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. I grew up in a corporate family. My dad worked for General Motors, started off in the insurance part, and then moved to finance. And his entire career, as a matter of fact, he's still alive. He's about to turn 77 and he still draws a pension. He loved General Motors. And back then in the 80s and 90s, corporations, when they promoted you, they transferred you. You couldn't just get a promotion and all of a sudden lead the people that you were peers with. So we moved around every 2 years all across the country. And that absolutely shaped what I was interested in and who I was, because we were this nuclear family, very close, me, my brother, my mom, and dad. We ate dinner together every single night and really needed each other as we moved around. And so the conversations at the dinner table were about General Motors and my father leading and how to motivate, how to build a team, how to, excuse me, how to communicate. But I don't think I really realized that, Mike, how influential that was, honestly, until just recently when I had my big book launch party and my father was there and all of my clients and friends and colleagues, and I'm making a speech. And I had dedicated my book to the city of New Orleans, where you don't have to be perfect, which absolutely influenced me. This joie de vivre city that is full of music and art and food and soul, probably one of the most European cities in the United States of America. And it absolutely influenced me and realized you shouldn't be a cookie cutter of everybody. So, and you're not going to be as successful or as happy as you try if you try to be a cookie cutter of everybody else. So I dedicated the book to the city of New Orleans, but as I'm up giving my speech at my book launch party and I'm staring at my dad and I'm talking about everything I learned about leadership, I realized that the book is dedicated to him, because everything I learned about leadership, as far as positive leadership, he was a role model.
Incredible. I know we were talking a little bit before we hit record about the influences that our families and our loved ones have had on us. So we really appreciate you sharing that. And it really does sound like your dad was an incredible role model for you. When you
He
were
really was. He really was. And what's interesting, Mike, he was the exact opposite of the other most influential role model in my life, which was my grandfather. Because so if you can picture my dad, corporate guy, the most positive person coming from the sales side and all about culture and building a team. And then my grandfather from my mom's side was an academic and very cerebral and had his PhD from Georgetown and worked for the government. And he went on a letter writing campaign when I had graduated from Auburn University, telling me he would send me at least once a month a letter. You need to go to graduate school. You need to go to graduate school. And so he even said, you know what, I'll give you a little bit of money if you just go to graduate school. So I thought, I'll get my master's degree. So I went back. Auburn offered me a full ride. I was teaching public speaking at age 22. And so I spent 2 years getting a master's degree. And then he started the letter writing again and said, you need to get a PhD. And I'm thinking, no, 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 no. That was not in the cards. I have my master's. I just wrote a thesis. I was recruited by a consulting firm in New Orleans, which is how I got here. I am happy, happy. And he kept saying, you can do it all, Michelle, because I thought, how in the world am I going to be a mom? And one day I want to be married. I want to raise kids. How am I going to do all of this, granddad? And he goes, I did it. You can do it too. And so I kind of went kicking and screaming up the road to LSU thinking, I can't believe I have to get a PhD. But guess what, Mike? He was right. He was totally right.
Well, it sounds as though it opened a lot of doors and that challenging and pushing you. And it sounds as though believing in you and really, you know, challenging you to become the best version of yourself is something that has lasted for a long time. And it sounds like is one of your grandfather's legacies that we're lucky for, because now you're able to teach and coach and mentor and guide people to really achieve their dreams.
Well said. You are absolutely right. I had two big male supporters of me going on and getting the highest level of degree, which absolutely helped with my credibility and the whole career. And I wouldn't be where I am today for sure. Well said. Thank you. So,
Well, God bless them both. Let's dive into the general themes of the book, and then we can go into some of the more nitty gritty and some of the stories and anecdotes that you share in the book, which I think are really, really powerful. Have a few specific quotations I'd love to get your opinion on. But one of my big takeaways and something you write about explicitly in the book is that leadership has moved from a position or a role of power to connection between people. It's a powerful, elegant hypothesis. What led you to first generate that idea? Like, can you walk us through your thinking as to maybe the moments you started realizing this? And then when did it start to become something where you said, hey, I think I'm really onto something here?
yeah, great question, Mike. So, when I became a professor, so again, kind of looking back, I had been recruited by a consulting firm here in New Orleans called Spectra. I found what I really wanted to do. I was a corporate trainer in my 20s, going around working with companies, leading workshops on public speaking, effective listening, meeting management, team building. I just loved it. And when a couple years later, when I was finishing my PhD at LSU, I was teaching a class at Loyola. And the dean heard about me and brought me into his office. And he said, I would like for you to teach full time business communication. And I thought, I didn't really think that that was going to be my path. I really saw myself as a consultant. So I started, so of course, I then pivot, right? Because the consulting world and the corporate training world is very different than the academic world. So now I'm 28 years old. I had been successful as a corporate trainer, but then I look around as a young academic now full time in the College of Business at Loyola, where there are very few women and very few young women, and very few young women that were way too enthusiastic at 8 a.m. in the morning. I brought a very different skill set, right, to the College of Business. Now, as somebody who moved around so much, I was really adept at fitting in. You get really good every 2 years of kind of assessing the situation and the culture and figuring out what do you wear and what's the language that people use and how do you fit in. So one of the first things I did is I looked around the College of Business and I formed a group of mentors who were very successful older men who I said, help me, I want to be successful as an academic. And I never saw myself like that. And so they were guys, older men who I absolutely idolized. And they reminded me of my grandfather, the academic, who was so cerebral, so stern, so philosophical, right? And so these guys would take me to lunch and they would say, okay, Michelle, to be successful in the MBA classroom on Monday nights from 6 until 9:30, lecture longer than the class is. Just keep lecturing, keep going, right? Demand that they read, 10 books instead of one. If they come in late to the classroom, lock the door. And so these gentlemen were successful with asserting their power. And it was almost like they were military drill sergeants. They saw their job as just kind of, knocking the kids down and then building them up. And they were beloved. And so I had subscribed to this. I was like, well, if that's successful and it's all about power, Dr. Johnston here, right? Then I'm going to do that because I want to be successful. So I led with power for years and couldn't understand why my teaching evaluations, my faculty evaluations were not good like my mentors. And it took me a while, Mike. I'm embarrassed to say I was a slow learner because I kept convincing myself, well, what? I need to keep emulating what they're doing. And maybe the students aren't used to a younger female. Maybe that's what it is, but I'm going to keep doing what I know is successful and right for the students. And it wasn't until one of my friends gave me a book by Brene Brown, whose research has really been influential, and it's called The Gifts of Imperfection. And she talked about how fitting in, which was the story of my life, trying to fit in, is the opposite of belonging, because you're always trying to be somebody else. You're not really you. And it was at that moment that I realized that I didn't have connection with myself, and I wasn't giving myself permission to be me at all in the classroom. And I remember sitting in one of my colleague, Dr. Kendra Reed's office. And of course, you have to publish or perish in academia. So we had our heads down. I wasn't doing any consulting. We were just publishing. And we were looking at the differentiating factors between high performing teams and low performing teams, and came across an article that said one of the most important factors is the presence of women. And I was reading more about this. I found it fascinating. And so the author said that if their guesses based on this conclusion of the study is that maybe that people actually behaved better around the women. They brought in differing perspectives. It just made the team experience better. And for some strange reason, Mike, that particular article on that particular day, it kind of struck me that I could perhaps be myself and stop trying to be like the older men who were so successful. Maybe I could be and showcase some of my feminine qualities, which I was not comfortable showcasing. I was much more of a nurturer, and I wanted I wanted to support them. I didn't want to knock them down. I wanted to build them up, right, immediately. And I was that was a huge risk. And so I finally went into the classroom. I said, you know what? I'm going to take the risk, and I'm going to do what I know is successful with adult learning. You learn by doing. You do role plays. You don't lecture for 3.5 hours. You build a positive team culture. All these things that I knew that I had kind of abandoned, I decided to try. And thankfully, it worked. And that's when I realized, whoa, I had not been connected with myself. Ergo, I wasn't connected with my students. There was a big barrier. And that's when it all started to gel, my theory and my thesis, that in order to truly connect with others, you have to abandon that power structure that we all had subscribed to for so long, give that up, and really work on true, meaningful connection that begins with yourself.
And it sounds as though that really is the journey that the reader goes on when they pick up a copy of The Seismic Shift in Leadership. I mean, you start the book with connecting with yourself, which you identify is arguably the most important stage of all, which I want to ask you about in a moment. Then it goes on to connecting with your team, and then to connecting with your organization. So let's go through those one by one, but let's start at the top. Why is connecting with yourself the most important?
Absolutely, Mike. So connecting with yourself is the foundation. So when I lifted my head up and I had gotten tenure, right, and I could go back into the consulting world, right, and I really wanted to be an executive coach because I had read in 2001 when I had my head down publishing or perishing. I read a New York article in 2001 about an executive coach before that word was even known or popular. And they profiled and followed Marshall Goldsmith around the world. And he basically at that time was coaching jerk bosses. The jerk bosses that even the family members thought was a jerk, and they were getting away with it. They were at the highest levels in the executive boardroom. And Marshall was one of the first people to say, look, you're a jerk. You can't get away with this. People don't like you. They don't like working with you. And so he had this model called stakeholder analysis, where he asked the client, the leader, to identify 10 or 15 key stakeholders that would allow this leader to be successful. And Marshall went in and interviewed them all and had these data books and called it Feed Forward, and kind of gave these clients, look, here's how people perceive your leadership. and they all want you to succeed. So here's the playbook for you to succeed. And that article really resonated with me. I thought, I want to do that one day when I can again. So now I lift my head up, I go and I follow his stakeholder analysis. I conduct 360s. I take on leaders as a leadership coach, right? And now I'm an executive coach, but it took years. I was, coaching new managers and new directors, and now I coach CEOs, right? But a number of years that I employed this process. And that's how I ultimately got into the 100 coaches group that you referred to, because I was coaching a number of leaders at a big organization who hired Marshall to be their big leadership event speaker. And so I was in the audience with my leaders, and Marshall Goldsmith is on stage saying, look, I just turned 70. I'm so blessed. I've made all the money I need to make. I now am much more interested in paying it forward and giving back. So if you would like to be mentored by me, send me an email and tell me why. So I ran home that day, Mike, and emailed Marshall Goldsmith and said, I've been following your work for years and I want to learn from the best. Would you please be my executive mentor? So he would be the number 3, probably most influential person in my life. And I got wholeheartedly rejected because I hadn't written a book yet or anything. I was just Michelle Johnston, professor, executive coach, going, hey, will you mentor me? It
Did
ended
he
up
did
that
he
he
let you
was,
down easy? Or was it just thanks but no thanks, Marshall? Or was
yeah,
it, something more
weeks,
elegant?
at
Or did
least,
his
yeah,
executive assistant respond? Or how did that
it
go
was,
down?
yeah, it was from him, an email that said, Michelle, thank you so much for your email. I didn't expect that 16,000 people would apply for me to be their mentor in the first week that I made that announcement. Why don't you loop back in 6 months? Well, years went by because then I was writing my book. And then when I had my book about to go off to the publisher, I thought, you know what? This would be a good time to loop back because now I have something that will differentiate myself, right? And so I looped back and showed him my book, and that was right when the world was shutting down. And here I had written a book, already written about the importance of meaningful connection, and the entire planet was disconnected. So that got my attention, and I called my publisher and I said, we cannot publish a book on connection when we're all in lockdown mode. And so I said, let's push pause. And I went back and I interviewed again these global CEOs and said, what in the world are you doing to connect when we're all at home? And thankfully I did that because I think, Mike, that's why my book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership, is now an Amazon bestseller, because we're all trying to figure that out, right? How in the world do we meaningfully connect in such a disconnected world? So my book has these concrete strategies. So in the opening chapter of the book, I talk about Marshall Goldsmith, and then I talk about how, as an executive coach, I started seeing leaders who had subscribed to the leadership style that I had subscribed to all those years as a young professor, all about power and control. Those leaders were getting pushed out. And it was the leaders who turned the equation of kind of talking and listening 80-20 backwards. So most leaders back then, it was very transactional. I'm the boss. I have all the answers. I do the talking. 80% of the time, I might ask you some questions 20% of the time. And the leaders that I was seeing that were successful flipped it, and they were saying, you know what? This is about you. I want you to develop as a leader. It's much more becoming more of servant leadership, right? I want to make this the best experience. I want to develop you. What can I do to remove the barriers? I don't have all the answers. I want to develop you so that you can figure it out yourself. So I was seeing in the coaching world, it was very palpable and it was very visible, this shift that the leaders who were creating inadvertently, they weren't doing it intentionally, but the leaders who were still leading with power and control were creating these cultures of fear. And what we realized when I was watching one of my CEOs of 40,000 employees on stage saying, I want us to be the most innovative system that delivers health. And I'm taking voracious notes like, okay, that's on me. How in the world am I going to coach these leaders to build teams that will be the most innovative system that delivers health? And I was looking around, and those leaders who had created cultures of fear, where it was all about power and control, their people were scared and they were opposite of innovative, right? They were scared to ask, what they thought maybe might be a stupid question. They were scared to take risks. It was a culture of fear. And that's when I realized that's out. We need to figure out how to build cultures of connection. And that changed everything.
And as you said, in today's world, where we're still less physically connected than we were before, Michelle, even though we're in this post-COVID era, so to speak, still less likely to jump on that plane, or less likely to fly across the ocean or sail across the ocean to see family, or to drive up that road trip to see the family, because you're still not quite sure. In today's day and age, it really feels like we are missing this sense of connection. And it's not an original thought from me by any stretch of the imagination, but what I think what you do in the first section of the book, especially connecting with yourself before you even get to the team, is you really map out that authenticity, as you put it, right? Owning your story, giving up on perfection, and owning your communication style. I wish we had time to go into every single one of these, but perhaps we can talk just briefly about owning your story first. There's a great quotation from your interview with John Nickens in the book that people will define your identity for you if you haven't already defined it. And then you follow that up with, you cannot change a person's behavior until you have first changed their belief. I feel like these two quotations are almost like a yin and yang in sorts, in terms of owning your own story and being authentic. Would you mind just giving our audience and listeners your thoughts on owning your story and being authentic?
Absolutely. So go back to my executive coaching observations and seeing the leaders who were creating cultures of fear getting pushed out of organizations. What I realized, and some of those leaders I was coaching. And because I began with the 360 process, I had all of this rich, robust data that I could go back and say, why are these leaders getting pushed out? And the data would say from their direct reports that their direct reports didn't trust them, that they were scared, that they weren't motivated. It wasn't a positive place to work, right? And so I define connection is employees want, if employees feel connected, then they are seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. So these leaders who had subscribed to this power and control and created these cultures of fear, what I realized is what came up in the data was their disconnection with their team, but it was only because they were disconnected from themselves. They were trying to be somebody else. What they thought in their head was successful. Same problem I had as a young professor in the MBA classroom. I thought, this can't be successful. I don't see this around me. So I'll just become somebody else. And a lot of these older leaders were like, well, this is the way it's always been done. And this is the way I'm going to do it. And my mentor did that. And my former boss did that. And I don't want to know about my people's personal lives. Are you kidding? I just want results, results, results. And so because they were trying, I call it the mask of perfection. And the more I've talked about on these podcasts about the mask of perfection, I really think it's more, people just want to be successful. And so when they wear a mask, it's just that they want to show up doing what they think will get them the results that they want. And they don't think that it's about meaningful connection. And so that's what this whole shift is about. The shift even refers to, Mike, how to lead on these Zoom experiences. If you're still subscribing to that old model of, I am the expert and I am here to tell you what to do in a more one-way transactional way, you're not going to build connection with your people on these calls at all. But instead, you've got to say, okay, for example, I just interviewed Juan Martin. He's the global president of Kind Bars. And I'm starting a podcast called The Seismic Shift. So he was on my podcast. And I said, Juan, what in the world are you, because he's based in New York City now, but he had been in Barcelona during the lockdown. And he's from the south of Spain. I said, what are you doing to meaningfully connect with your people? And he said, The first thing we did, Michelle, in our Manhattan offices, once our employees said that they really don't want to come back 5 days a week to the office, they'd much rather work from home and maybe 2 to 3 days a week get in the office, we redid everything. And now I don't even have a private office, because when you're in the office, it's all about collaboration. We want to work together as a team. We don't want you to go into your silo, shut the door. You can do that at home. So he said we changed the office environment to promote more of that collaboration, since we don't see each other as much. He said, number two, he said, and when he said this, he lifted up his espresso cup. He said, Michel, he said, I'm a European. I love espresso. He said, so my people know, at his direct reports as the global president, or the highest level, they know that in our one-on-one meetings, we're going to spend the first 5 to 10 minutes drinking espresso together and connecting on a personal level. I want to know, how are you feeling this week? This is hard. How's your family? Have your kids gone back to school? Right? He said, I've got to connect with them on that personal level, like we're having coffee together. And then we're going to go into the agenda and the goals and the results and how are you increasing revenue by 30%. But I'm not going to begin with that.
And for such a senior level person, for such a leader with a wide mandate and a big P&L and a big team, to be able to communicate in a slightly different way with all of, it sounds like, his direct reports, yet at the same time a consistent way so that everybody knows that's him. I feel like that's a big challenge. And that's something you talk about in the book as well, with owning your communication style, that other people have different communication preferences. So to successfully connect and motivate your teams, you need to understand your own strengths and blind spots, understand their communication styles, and then adapt accordingly. The question that I was left with in this section of the book was, how do I have a consistent communication style if I also need to adapt to my audience? It sounds as though this gentleman has a great way with the espresso cup. Do any other tactical or sort of practical approaches to this consistent but customized approach come to mind?
Absolutely. When I started working with one of my favorite leaders, Pete November, he was relatively new to this organization, and he had been a part of a law firm, and he had been a part of a healthcare company. When he came to this organization, the CEO said, "Okay, you've got to own your operating rhythm, and you've got to identify who are the key stakeholders that are going to allow you to be successful, and come up with a schedule, a meeting rhythm, so that you have one-on-ones as much as you should, daily huddles, team meetings, town halls that you round. We call it rounding, even if you're not in a hospital, in the corporate environment. Are you getting out of your office and rounding?" And so he realized, whoa, and so he emulated, like a lot of us do, his CEO, his boss. And his CEO, I developed this assessment called the communication preference profile. So his CEO is high content and action. And the leader that I was coaching is high people and action. So he tried for the first year or so up on stage delivering presentations, just like his CEO, high graphs, high data, high content, and got the feedback like, who are you? And he tells the story, and I feel so bad about this. I was coaching him on his big presentations, and after his big presentation, I went behind backstage and I said, Pete, who was that? And whenever he and I are together in front of a group, because we get along so well, and I still coach him to this day, years later, he tells the audience, he said, and Michelle came backstage and said, Pete, you were awful. I said, I did not say that. I just said, who was that? Because that's not the Pete that I know. And he realized at that time he had to give up trying to be somebody else's communication style. And he had to own the fact that he was a high people person and high action. So now he begins and he just had a big presentation at a big leadership event and called me right afterwards and said, Michelle, I love being on stage now. And so many people came up to me and gave me compliments. They're like, you were awesome. He said, that was because of you. I said, no. That is because of you. You finally gave your yourself permission to be you as a communicator and to own your style and not try to emulate somebody else. So he gets up in these huge leadership events and he begins with a patient story, or he begins with a story about himself making a big mistake. He begins with some sort of a people story, and then gets everybody involved. And at the very end has this call to action. And so that plays into his strengths as a communicator. I also get to sit in during the pandemic. I got to be a part of his Zoom meetings with his team for almost 2 years. And he was way ahead of the curve as far as connection. And he would make his team, and he did this even before the pandemic. He's like, I know this drives you all crazy. And he had about 8 to 10 direct reports at the highest level. He said, I know this drives you crazy, but we're going to go around because I care about you. And before we get to, he's the CFO now, before we get into the financials, and he said, I want to know on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing personally? And how are you doing professionally? And some of his people would roll his eyes. You're like, no, I don't want to do it. He goes, sorry. So he would begin every meeting like that. And the rest of the organization, and this is one of the things when I would interview Pete, I would say, what does success look like to you as a leader? And he said, I know when somebody's a successful leader, when others come to me and say, what can I do? Can you transfer me to their division? I just want to learn from that person. And that's true about Pete November. So many people come up to me and say, is there any way that I can just transfer to his division so I can be a part of those team meetings? Because my leader doesn't care about me. In the 2 years during the pandemic, I had somebody come up to me and cry after I did a keynote address out in California. She said, I ended up leaving that company because in the 2 years during the pandemic, I was home alone and he never once asked how I was doing. And life is too short and I cannot work for somebody like that. So yeah, you really have to be intentional with connection. So you have to own your style and also kind of say, I need to connect with you all at a personal level, and then we're going to focus on results. And I recommend that for every leader that I work with.
And I feel like you just touched on so many of the key points, Michelle, of compassion, connecting with your team, showing care for the whole person, listening first, acting as a servant leader, and then connecting with the organization. That operating rhythm that you talked about is really about alignment, personally aligning with the organization, owning your calendar. Maybe we can finish up on this idea of creating a positive culture as you talk about in the book. Something you're very clear about is that if we want to be a hyper effective or a truly authentic leader, we should personally align our values with the organization, right? The culture of the org and the personal values should be in simpatico. And then how do we take it and go one step further to create that positive culture? Certainly the meetings with our team, connecting with them on a personal level. Are there other things that we can do to an even greater extent to really make that seismic shift?
Yeah, one of the leaders I was most impressed with, who's in my book, is Todd Graves. And Todd Graves is the founder and CEO of Raising Cane's Chicken Fingers. And I went to Auburn, and he's around my age, and he was at the University of Georgia and worked for this chicken finger restaurant that every home football game, the line was down the block, down the street. And he worked there in college, and he thought, this is huge. I want to be a part of this. He went to the family who owned it and he said, can I buy a franchise? Are you interested in expanding? And they said no. And he said, okay. So when he graduated, he went back to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he was from. And LSU is right there. And at the gates of LSU, Louisiana State University, he built his first chicken finger place. And he decided to make the motto, the mission, one love, one love. And that was really rare back then. He wanted to create this positive culture for college students to work in fast food that was actually fun and cool and that was purpose driven. So you would look down the street and there'd be a McDonald's and there'd be a Burger King, and you'd go in the restaurant and the employees were not very happy. And you would go into a Raising Cane's chicken finger restaurant, and there's cool music playing, and they've got cool outfits and cool hats, and they're able to bring their personalities at the drive-through. They would do really cute little cluck cluck little chicken jokes, and he wanted to build a positive culture and have fun. And because he started himself, he was still frying the chicken and running the cashier. And now it is a global company. But he knew back then, he said, I want everybody to be equal. Everybody in here, no matter how high you get up in the organization, whether you work in corporate or not, you're at the end of the day a fry cook and a cashier. And that mentality paid off because during the pandemic, it was so hard to find labor. Their drive-throughs were just, I mean, literally a mile long. They couldn't find the labor. So he brought everybody from the corporate office back into the fast food chain, the restaurants, and they were fry cooks and chicken
Wow.
fingers. And they were wearing the hats and the music was playing and they made it a positive culture. That's just he's an impressive leader, Todd Graves.
That sounds like a documentary on Netflix waiting to happen right there.
Yes.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for walking us through some of the key concepts within the seismic shift in leadership. Could you share with us, just as we wrap up, what are you up to next? I know you have some travel and some teaching and lecturing planned. You're starting your own podcast. Where can we keep up to date with all of your adventures and your work?
Oh, thank you, Mike. Yeah. MichelleKJohnston.com is my website, and I try to put all of the podcasts. I'll put this podcast up there. I am going and guest lecturing at American University in Rome this summer. And so I'm looking forward to getting out of the United States. We all, as human beings, are looking forward to connecting. And I can't wait to be abroad with students and do these guest lectures. I'm on my speaking tour, my book tour. And I just love meeting people, doing fireside chats, and getting the message out there that it really is about owning your story as a human. Who are you? What was a significant life event that made you who you are today? Own that, right? And then once you own that story, and you're connected with yourself, then the world is your oyster. Then you can connect with others, and then you can connect with your organization. It's really an exciting time. And I'm just thrilled to get out there and get the message out there.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Johnston, Michelle, thank you for everything again today. We're going to link down below in the notes to your website, to the book, to all of your work. And we look forward to keeping up with your successes, of which we know there are going to be many very, very soon.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for connecting.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye bye.
Bye.